Morning, everyone. So I have been asked to introduce Dr. Beryl Bachman to you, and I'm very pleased to welcome her to Cornerstone today. Her keynote is on the topic of Freirean pedagogy, which, as you know, is Cornerstone's core teaching and learning philosophy. Dr. Botman obtained a BA degree, higher diploma in education, and a Bachelor of Education honours from the University of Cape Town. After qualifying, she taught Afrikaans first and second language at Lavender Hill Secondary School during the 1980s and 1990s. Thereafter, she worked in the rural Western Cape as Deputy Chief Education Specialist, Language Education. The University of the Western Cape conferred the degree of Masters of Education on her in 1995. In 2014, Dr. Botman graduated with a PhD in the Philosophy of Education Policy Studies from Stellenbosch University. Her PhD took Freire's educational philosophy as a key starting point. After completing her PhD, she took up a postdoctoral research fellow at Free State University fellowship. As widow of Prof. Hyman Russell Botman, who unexpectedly passed away during his second term as Rector and Vice-Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, she chairs the Russell Botman Bursary Fund. She is a member of the Russell Botman Memorial Lecture Committee and has contributed to the edited volume Russell Botman, A Tribute, 1953 to 2014. And Dr. Botman has recently published her creative non-fiction work, Without You, or Sedert die Dood ons skei, and you have to forgive my Afrikaans pronunciation. So I can pass these around if you'd like to have a look. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It's for me wonderful to be here. This is my second visit to this facility. I'm good and old friends. We can say it now. We are old friends from way back when we were studying, when I'm doing those qualifications that you presented here. So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I don't do this much, so thank you. I have been out of circuit with these kinds of things, so here we are, but it's such a great pleasure looking at the philosophy of Paulo Freire. I call it representing because I see Cornerstone as being representative of Paulo Freire's education philosophy, and it's good for us to do things again, to do things over and do things anew. And so I will stick to my script. I am Afrikaans first language speaker, so English is my second language, and so that is why I prefer to stick to my script in this instance. This presentation attempts to offer a very concise synopsis of the education philosophy of Paulo Freire. I argue that his life experience and education philosophy are mutually inclusive and therefore demonstrate that they are ontologically and epistemologically inseparable. I contend that Freire illustrates the education philosophy, that education philosophy is connected to everyday life and the lives of citizens. I can't emphasize that more, and I will repeat that many times. Freirean philosophy of education calls for an inquiry into ways of being and ways of knowing, to speak to our particular social, political, and economic situation. Therefore, the philosophy should take ontological cognizance of the development of people within the education sector, and it's just been foregrounded with the previous discussion on the reflection of the previous day. People, development of people. The ontology and epistemology should lead the dialogue towards placing education in local, regional, and global contexts. The presentation also discusses the developments and shifts from his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to a Pedagogy of Hope and beyond. Freirean education, let me just forget to do this. You see, I'm out of practice. There's, that was the introduction that I'm going to. Freirean education philosophy represents his thinking and actions as lived philosophy, drawing on experiences and thought through engaging in self-critique and critique in general. In presenting some insights into the education philosophy that Frey has developed through his life experience and knowledge gained, it serves to illustrate that in education, people development and knowledge development are interrelated. Education engages learning about being the self, with others, and in the world, as well as knowing the self, knowing others, and knowing the world. The seminar highlights Freirean education philosophy by engaging his thinking with reference to reading the word and reading the world, thus relating education philosophy with the world of work and education administration, literacy education, critical consciousness, and democracy. I will conclude with some remarks regarding Freire and South African education, very briefly. Because Freire contends that life experiences and philosophy are mutually inclusive, I will attempt at drawing some relations on his life and the development of his philosophy of education. From an early age, Freire was deeply aware of his own socio-economic conditions and found that he was comparing himself with other children of his age in the same circumstances. Growing up in poverty led him to the understanding that there was something wrong with the world that needed to be corrected. Gadotti relates Freire's first experiences of reading to his parents. According to Gadotti, Freire's elementary education was interrupted because the family moved to Jaupatau outside Recife. Freire himself described schools in the area as precarious and teachers as mediocre. The negative influences of some of Freire's teachers who ascribe rote learning as a major part of the instructional process in school viewed him as having learning difficulties and being ignorant. That's according to Carrillo. As well as having mild retardation. Horton and Frey. Freire started working at the Social Service of Industry, it's called SESI, in 1947, and describes this period as a decade in which he was involved in the most important political, pedagogical practice of my life. As part of the first SESI Education Committee responsible for the provisioning of service and education, Freire saw creation of the sessie as an attempt to ease class conflict and stop the development of political and military consciousness amongst workers. As such, any practice stimulating critical knowledge was restricted. A further lesson learned at the sessie is that democracy can be taught not only through discourse about democracy, but by action. Education should advance the democratic learning process by giving popular classes opportunities to read the world. Therefore, progressive educators need to bring life itself into the classroom. Now, the classroom to which Freire is referring is much different to the classroom we are in at this time. The classroom you are speaking about now is also something foreign for me. So we have to rethink also that space of classroom, and how do we still take what Freire is teaching us about reading the word and reading the world into this new classroom space we are moving into. Therefore, his work at sessie caused Freire to understand that he was a continuously unfolding ontological and epistemological process of growth, being and knowing. Freire's work and ideas regard literacy, and his theories of knowledge should be understood in the context of the people among whom he worked. With their illiterate and living in a culture of silence, the idea of using generative words to move them to participate in their own learning led to his first experiments with a method of learning to read. And this is the same challenge that I heard now this morning. How do we engage our students? A similar thing, different situation. And we need to, and that is why I think such engagement of this conference is so important. Freire presented his theories of knowledge and educational philosophy, particularly in relation to literacy, in more detail in the book Education, the Practice of Freedom. What Freire introduced into educational philosophy and theory was essentially the notion of challenging a banking method of education by applying conscientization, which then developed into pedagogy. The method that Freire developed in his quest to teach literacy follows 3 stages in the formation of critical consciousness. In the first investigation stage, the daily life of the pupils was used to discover the universe of vocabulary through the selection of generative words according to their syllabic length, phonetic value, and social meaning. The second stage included codification and decodification of contextualized themes, known as the thematization stage, using the reading and writing. Carrillo distinguishes contextualization as a separate and distinct stage, and also identifies other stage before problematization, namely a non-rigid working agendum to assist coordinators. The third and final stage, according to Gadotti, involved problematization, meaning a return from the abstract to the concrete, limiting political, cultural, social, and economic situations was related to concrete action. The act of reading and writing became the instruments of struggle and social and political activity. The final objective of the method was conscientization, in terms of which oppressive realities are experienced as a process which can be changed or overcome. Shaw describes Freire's critical consciousness as having 4 qualities. The first quality is power awareness, meaning knowing and understanding that human society and history are not static, but can be made and remade by individuals, as well as organized groups. Being aware of power means knowing who dominates power in society and why, and how power is organized and used. The second quality is critical literacy. It refers to habits of analytical thinking, speaking or discussing, reading and writing. One of my criticisms of Paulo Freire is that he never includes listening, and listening I would include. And goes beyond the surface to understanding the deeper meaning of events, texts, techniques, processes, objects, statements, images, and situations, while applying that meaning to one's own context or situation. The third is desocialization. That is recognizing and critically challenging regressive myths, values, behaviors, and language, and that are internalized into consciousness, such as racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, glorification of the rich and powerful, hero worship, excessive consumerism, runaway individualism, militarism, and national chauvinism. Finally, the fourth quality is self-organization and self-education, meaning that individuals take the initiative to transform schools and society into being democratic with an equal distribution of power, participatory social engagement, and recognizing the intellectualism of mass education. To develop the critical consciousness is to engage in student-centered dialogue, which problematizes generative themes from daily life and other topics relevant to society and academic subject matter. Shaw offers an agenda of values for the pedagogy as participatory, situated, critical, democratic, dialogical, desocialization, multicultural, research-orientated, activist, and affective, and includes the emotions. According to Freire, these ideas and methods should be applied and reinvented in every different situation. Freire has opened a frontier of liberating education that we will have to develop in our own places, on our own terms, and in our own words. It was during his imprisonment in June 1964 that the relationship between politics and education became much clearer to him, and is realizing that social change was an undertaking of the masses and not of isolated individuals. After his release, he opted for exile. In exile, he started working with the child and literacy schemes of the Bolivian Ministry of Education. Problems related to altitude forced him to leave Bolivia, and he went to Chile, where he lived from 1964 to 1969. His experience there focused on establishing agrarian reform in a new structure of health, credit, technical assistance, schools, and basic infrastructure services. One just needs to follow Chile's social development as it is now to see how these kinds of things they valued and how it's taken some time, but how it's starting to pay off. Soon after an invitation to work at Harvard, where he stayed for 6 months, he also received an offer to work in Geneva, Switzerland, at the World Council of Churches, as principal consultant for its education department. He worked with this organization for 10 years, mainly because of its work with African countries in their struggle for liberation against the hegemony of colonial rule. The popularity of his new educational perspective and the philosophy grew everywhere in Africa, including in Africa. The African countries where he worked included Tanzania, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Sao Tome e Principe, as well as expressing a keen interest in adult education in Angola and Mozambique. Freire returned to Brazil. That meant that 15 years' absence demands learning in a greater intimacy for the Brazil of today. That's in quotes. I have come back, he says, I've come back to relearn Brazil. And I suppose the kinds of our contexts keep on shifting, and we need to reinterpret our situations as we go along and relearn our country as it is. He participated in teachers and popular education movement, as well as in the struggle of the working class. He worked with issues such as hunger, the power of Brazilian television, and education transformation in general. Freire published Education and Change, first published in Brazil in 1979, which examined the education system in the process of social change as being committed as a pedagogical act. As Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo, now Sao Paulo is in Brazil, is both a city, a major metropolis, as well as a region, like we would think of it as a province. So he was the Secretary of Education of the province, to use that term. He had to grapple with the complex questions of educational philosophy on the one hand and the administrative policy on the other. The experiences and reflections of his term of office have been recorded in his work, Pedagogy of the City, 1993. Freire sees this book as an introductory discussion of what we collectively let me read that. Freire sees this book as, open quotes, an introductory discussion of what we collectively dreamed of doing, what we did, and what continues to be done in the Municipal Bureau of Sao Paulo, to report not only what we have achieved, but also what we were not able to accomplish. Close quote. Reynolds points out that Freire demonstrates that he is a philosopher, theoretician, and an effective practitioner. His observation confirms the central thesis that public education must play a decisive role in the continuing reformation of a democratic society in which all of us can have the freedom and opportunity to create knowledge from our own experiences. The book, Pedagogy of Hope, is presented to Paulo Freire as his revisitation of or re-encounter of pedagogy of the oppressed. In one sense, now, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1974, and Pedagogy of Hope, published in 1994, so it's 20 years on. In one sense, it expresses a journey from the one to the other, while it also claims to form a continuity. What starts out as an introduction to a new edition of Pedagogy of Hope, a new edition of Pedagogy of the Oppressed in the 1990s, developed into a whole new work. As the subtitle of the book of Pedagogy of Hope is Reliving Pedagogy of the Oppressed suggests, Freire still regarded the debate on freedom, fear of freedom, liberty and authority, and the democratization of the public school as contemporary issues. He also continued to stress the importance of dialogue. The importance of dialogue in the effort to read the world. In addition to, he states that the self-reflection and self-critique from a permanent process that requires patience and humility. He seeks not only to explain pedagogy of the oppressed, but also the development of his thought, together with reacting to criticism of and objections to his work. In keeping with his problem-posing method, Freire represents hope as some rethink of his approach to education. The shifts from pedagogy of the oppressed to pedagogy of hope are particularly apparent in relation to the radical connection between politics and education, where the development points to the thinking that there is more conscious disconnect or contentious relation between education and politics. The latter work recognizes the awareness of different contexts of education and praxis, thus warning against generalizability. It is in the specific reading of the world that popular accountability has to be established. The popular groups have to express their discourse, syntax and semantics, as well as their dreams and desires, as part of progressive political education. A further key point of discussion in this shift has to do with the issue of freedom and authority. Freire is a theorist of freedom with a need for authority. Freire does not come to the freedom does not come at the expense of authority. What he does argue against very strongly is authoritarianism. Authority and freedom, as well as authoritarianism, are discussed in more detail when we look at teachers and learners. A further development in Freire's philosophical analysis lies in the notion that existential experience as pedagogical thought is developed and placed in the context of and radicalization of the teacher-student relationship. The teacher's authority is undone in relation to the student's experience thereof. This relationship should also speak of hope in education, of hope if education is seen to be future-orientated. The notion of hope in Freirean thought relates also to an expression by a poor farm worker from the forest zone of Pernambuco, who said to Paulo Freire, "I am a countryman, sir. I have no tomorrow that is any different from today, that is any different from yesterday." Close quote. This is a despairing consciousness, and therefore not progressive. Critical consciousness is what makes that being one present in the world, also being fundamentally in need of reference to a tomorrow. This is where the engagement of a critical consciousness starts, in the hunger for a tomorrow as a crucial part of reference. It's a crucial point of reference. Hope then becomes a necessary component of one's radical being, a presence in the world. Freire then argues that the matrix of hope is the same as that of the possibility of education for human beings, becoming conscious of themselves as unfinished beings. Aware of one's unfinished nature, one becomes an aspirational about tomorrow in a continuous, hopeful search. This is what progressive education wants to achieve. Education, he argues, is indeed the process of that search for hope that resides in a tomorrow that is possible. He argues that there has never been a greater need to underscore educational practice with a sense of hope than there is today. And I think it still holds true today. The reference to today points to the current global context in which neoliberal market determinism and the cynicism of a fatalistic mindset have captured the self-consciousness of individuals. Freire centers his thought in Pedagogy of Hope on two cornerstones of education practice. Firstly, the matrix of hope is the matrix of education. And secondly, what we experience contextually as globalization makes a critical pedagogy of hope a necessary corollary of contemporary critical consciousness. One is empowered by critical consciousness to act on the world as an intervention for its future outcomes. This is hope as a world-transforming education, seeking a different and a better tomorrow. South African education during the struggle for democracy has definite links with Freirean thought, particularly regarding his philosophy of education as expressed in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire's connection to the South African political and education situation played a major role in the revisiting of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, leading to the development of a new and quite different Pedagogy of Hope. The Freirean problem-posing method presents hope as the rethinking of being oppressed, in relation to which he gives greater recognition to the awareness of differing contexts of education and practice. I just want to remark that in quite a number of Freirean conversations, people seem to be stuck with pedagogy of the oppressed. And Paulo Freire, as I have illustrated, has moved beyond that. He's gone and is revisited that pedagogy. So when we engage with Freire, yes, we take along all those, especially the issues of critical consciousness and generative themes and situating the reading the word and reading the world. We take that with us, but he has extensively revisited those notions. And when we engage Paulo Freire in today and today's situation, we must take his learnings since pedagogy of the oppressed. And he has done, and I've mentioned quite a number of his different pedagogies, like the pedagogy of the city, as well into our analysis of pedagogy as well as education philosophy. Now in South Africa, the NDP calls on education to play a significant, if not dominant, role in the transformation of our society and communities. In engaging a philosophy of education that draws on ontological and epistemological foundations, we constantly question and interrogate our being and knowing using problem-posing methods. One of the two priorities for transforming South African society and communities that the NDP identifies is the quality of education. The education philosophy of Paulo Freire could prove to be at the least helpful in understanding the questions that have to be dealt with in addressing quality education. The NDP's call for an engaging and responsible citizenry working towards an equal, just society also happens to be the very essence of the education philosophy as presented by Paulo Freire. Freire could provide a philosophical base for developing citizens and the knowledge systems necessary for social transformation. If we consider including the qualities describing Freire's concept of critical consciousness, namely power, awareness, critical literacy, desocialization, and self-organization, and self-education into our philosophy of education in South Africa, we would be well on our way to developing the citizenry in the manner the NDP envisions. In the choice of a pedagogy of hope can become an approach to education. I argue that in envisioning an education system in conjunction with the NDP in the following way, we need a pedagogy of hope for South African education to realize its vision. And I quote the NDP, education empowers people to define their identity, take control of their lives, raise healthy families, take part confidently in developing a just society, and play an effective role in the politics and governance of the communities, close quote. It's the National Planning Commission 2011. This broad vision for the entire education sector combines philosophical issues of ontology and epistemology and refers specifically to schools and teacher education. A pedagogy of hope at this stage of our development in South Africa with the persistent prevailing challenges seems not only viable but essential, despite all the policy development and implementation and several revisions. The NDP is and opportunity in time. The role of teachers is at the heart of the Vision 2030 and should be highly valued and recognized. Teachers should have sound subject knowledge that is subjected to continuing development. Schools need to be managed by skilled and dedicated principals who foster a vibrant but disciplined environment that is conducive to learning. Principals should further take responsibility for implementing the curriculum. The other partners in the school community, namely parents and the community, also need to be drawn into the meaningful relationship that would enhance teaching and learning. Engaging in a pedagogy of hope in South Africa calls for some serious reorientation of policy. By so doing, we could give expression to the chosen underpinning philosophy of education, aligning all current policy and implementation guidelines and practices. The underpinning philosophy would reflect our particular local, regional, continental, and global situation. The concepts, generalizability, freedom and authority, despairing and critical consciousness could guide such a reorientation of the philosophy of education. These concepts engage with the question of whether post-apartheid teacher education policy prepares teachers to be agents of an educational philosophy of hope. For these concepts to be dealt with requires a deepening of education philosophical thought and action. The explicit philosophy of education should foreground the development and implementation of a specific pedagogy, a pedagogy of hope for South African education. We need much more pedagogical depth in a vision for education that engages and in a renewed pedagogy of hope that constitutes the unleashing of the emancipatory potential of a teacher as an agent of democratic change and constitutes authority and reflectiveness, including self-reflectiveness and criticality, on the understanding that the teacher is an unfinished being, always in becoming. A teacher, as an unfinished being, has the capacity to name and transform the world and his, her, their own surroundings and make decisions and choices. Furthermore, the unfinished teacher questions, speaks of her, himself, themselves, and others, unveils and reveals truths, and becomes a presence in the world. The unfinished nature of beings implies a permanent process of hopeful search, and therefore is always future orientated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, maybe you can hang on a little bit if you have questions. Well, I think we can do even better to just applaud what we have just heard. So let's give a good round of applause to Dr. Bachman. Well, a lot has been said. Quite heavy stuff have been put forward. And before we go into groups to really engage more, I want to first open just the opportunity for anyone who has got a burning issue to raise before we go into groups. If you want to do it in the groups, also fine, but I think it's good that we just start off or round off this session by a little bit of engagement before we break. So let me invite you, if you really have something that you want to ask or say at this time, please, this is now the opportunity for you. The issue for me, maybe while you still do think that I obviously want to ask to ponder on also as we go into groups will be the question of really pedagogy of hope and how hope translates into what we do in our classrooms and also in the institution as such. What does it really mean and how does it translate the practical implementation of hope, a pedagogy of hope? How will that be for us? So I think for me that's a big issue that I would like us to reflect upon and even maybe to respond on also as we do go into groups. So that's one thing, I mean, that I got out as a challenge and as something I should reflect upon. Yes, Darren, you could.
Thank you. Just short. What stood out for me was our responsibility as educators outside of the textbook was teacher as an agent of democratic change, and how do I now bring that into the classroom? Very powerful. Thank you.
First, I want to commend you for a very, informative presentation. My question is rather a bit theoretical. I know you've not been in this field for I don't know how many years. Yes. So just out of curiosity, I see quite a lot of resemblance between Freire's theoretical persuasion with the radical leftist, Marxist and neo-Marxist theory of social change. But there are a lot of scholars who believe that he was neither a Marxist nor a radical scholar. I don't know what is your thinking, and because a lot of resemblance, for example, especially when it comes to social inequalities, class analysis and critical consciousness. I mean, that's pretty much radical leftist stuff. So was he really like a radical, a revolutionary, or he was just concerned about, change in the education system, but not broader, socioeconomic transformation or revolution? Or if I may rephrase it, was he a socialist? Because quite a lot of his theoretical, arguments are pretty much, Marxist socialist in my perspective.
Thank you. Well, I think let me get to day 3, and then you could respond.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you very much for the presentation. For me, that really stands out is perhaps to problematize the notion of pedagogy of the oppressed. And I hear that you're saying that Freire has also moved on to pedagogy of the city. But to contextualize this and bring it within a South African context, where of course we are how many years in democracy, which we struggle to see, but also as a teacher and a lecturer to bring this within the classroom, being conscious of the diversity within a South African context. And as a progressive discourse, one could then have various types of problems focusing on the pedagogy of the oppressed if we revert back to the past 2 days' discussions also on pedagogy and teaching that some of the speakers brought or presented. So with the diversity in South Africa and with the consciousness of being, bringing a pedagogy that's inclusive, when we problematize that, it could become way problematic in a classroom where we have various different students that come from various different backgrounds, and then how do we bring that consciousness or that critical consciousness within that classroom, particularly bringing together a way of being and the epistemology with the ontology. I mean, I can still try and clarify, but it's going to take too long, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have got two more people, the last two, and then I think you could just respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Botman. We're really impressed with what you brought to us. But to me, if we look at teacher education, we are the lecturers, and we have a huge responsibility to prepare our teachers for the reality, the world of the school out there. Because if we look in our schools today, and it's a reality in South Africa, we really, I think teachers have a huge responsibility to get across that pedagogy of hope in the classroom, because our learners, they come from various backgrounds, and they have this baggage that they bring into the classroom. So the pedagogy of hope is something that we as lecturers, we must really prepare our students to make that mind shift from a student to a teacher. Because at the moment, they care very much about their marks and their distinctions. And we must prepare them for the world out there, because they are going to work with those vulnerable learners coming from various walks of life, and they must instill, they must prepare, they must, we must successfully prepare them so that they can instill this pedagogy of hope into the future citizens of South Africa, so that we can really change South Africa, and that we can really have democracy, and we can really have this, parity, that this, I'm thinking of the word, so that we can have this equality of in South Africa, in our society. Because at the moment, the inequality is really very, very alarming. And as lecturers, we have that. We cannot only teach them the pedagogy, we can't only teach them the methodology, how to teach, but also look at the learner holistically. So we, as lecturers, have a huge responsibility.
Thank you, Beryl, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I think you challenge us, especially when you talk about moving on, because, not taking pedagogy of the oppressed as our Bible, as it were. But certainly, I think there's some underlying principles there that prevails, especially when you talk about the banking methodology and how we at Cornerstone have to strive to move away from the rote forms of learning and so on. And so those prevail, and I think they're still very relevant for today, especially in the context of us talking about how do we translate our programs, how do we implement our programs in the online space, so that in the online space we still have those values and those principles and those underpinning theories and philosophies that the Freirean methodology promotes. And so that for us is the challenge. And I think what you've shared with us today is really, arming us for beginning to think around what do we actually do in the day-to-day implementation, given the challenges of diversity, given the challenges of what we face in our society, and how it is that we want to make an impact in promoting social justice and human dignity out there. Thank you.
So the first question was, in a nutshell, was Paulo Freire revolutionary? I don't think Freire categorized himself as this or that, as a Marxist, as a socialist. But I do, he can be interpreted as a person with Marxist tendencies and socialist tendencies. He was also a Christian, he was a Catholic, he had a Catholic, strong Catholic upbringing. So he is all of that. And I think, but Paulo Freire's strength is the issue of reading the world and how the world is an awful place and it needs to be changed. And that is what, if that isn't revolutionary, then I don't know what the revolution is. Yeah, so he has had strong criticism against that pedagogy of the oppressed, and he was also labeled, and he was a sexist. He never spoke of women. He referred to women in his books or used inclusive language, and that is true, and he admitted to that. And so there are many other criticisms that he took up. He didn't just leave it. So that is why we read Pedagogy of the Oppressed still remains his seminal work, because it was completely off the chart from anything else that has been produced or read or written on education before. And that is why it is important that we don't chuck Pedagogy of the Oppressed out, but we must remember that it has been developed. So that remains the base. And so I think that leads to the second question, that you have to deal with a diversity of people, and I think that is one of, where shall I stand that you can also see me? Maybe you should come sit here in front. One of the major shifts that Freire made with in the rethinking and revisiting Pedagogy of the Oppressed was, it's that notion that he saw it important that he couldn't only, that society cannot only be transformed by the oppressed. You have to take the oppressor along. And as both those groupings, that is where he places the hope part in. And he is hoping that in the engagement of oppressed and oppressor, that they will see what the hope is for all of us together, for taking our world to a better world. And so we are expected to operate with people coming from various backgrounds, with various philosophies of life. And so in that, we must question, what is it that we want to achieve? Do we want an equal society? Do we want a democratic society? And in democracy, who are the ones that must be able to participate? If it is all of us, then we have to take this road together. I think that is one of the, for me also, one of the major shifts from oppressed to hope. I go I went into much more detail of these things when I did my dissertation. So, I couldn't unpack all of that. The third issue is about teacher education, and that is that teacher education needs to prepare teachers to act in the world, in a classroom where the classroom is a representation of the world. And if you are educating teachers, you must educate teachers that can be active in a society that is not homogeneous. And therefore, it is important if I would just say, it's just about, if you can just do one major thing with a teacher is by reading the word and reading the world. If that is a major responsibility of a teacher in education and a teacher in the classroom, a teacher must read. A teacher must read a variety of things, texts, to be able to take that reading into the classroom. A teacher must read the word and read the world. So a teacher must know what is happening in the world. And so there is that responsibility that a teacher cannot do banking education by following a textbook when the world is much bigger. With time the textbook is printed, that knowledge has developed quite significantly. And so how do you engage with that basics? Same as you have to engage with pedagogy of the oppressed, but place that into a new world. And so you have to, in teacher education, prepare a teacher to be able to be active in reimagining the world and engaging with the students. A teacher needs to know a student. You need to know your students. Now your world is big. You in Asia and everywhere, your students. But it is still your responsibility to know what they're thinking, how they're living. You have mentioned it this morning. That is your responsibility as the lecturer. And so the teachers that go out into schools or classrooms, wherever they go, whatever form the classroom take, the teacher has to, and that is, the teacher has to engage the learners, the students. And that is, if you can know what is it that triggers your learners, what is it that is important, what makes them tick, and you bring it into the classroom, their world becomes part of your classroom. That is when you won't have trouble to find them to be engaged, because they feel part of the learning, they have a say, and that is challenging banking education basically. Just one thing that I would like to add is that Paulo Freire has been labeled not only as anti-revolutionary, but he has also been labeled as a person who provided us with a methodology of education. And there is a difference between a methodology of education and pedagogy. And as you have noticed, I prefer philosophy of education, because he started out as what he presented to us is a methodology with the generative themes and working with literacy and adults and that kind of context. But what he has developed from there was a pedagogy which is an approach to your practice, your praxis in your classroom, but what is even more important and a deeper level is a philosophy of education, and that is why there is this big emphasis, this heavy emphasis of knowing and being are mutually inclusive. And that makes Freire's educational thoughts a philosophy. You can't claim to be a Freirean teacher if you don't live like a Freirean. If you are undemocratic in other areas and you want to be democratic in your classroom, it's mutually inclusive. If you're teaching and you're living must be mutually inclusive. And you don't have to be a Paulo Freirean scholar. You can be that, but you must be an authentic educator, and you must, and it's not just about the educator that must be a being and a knowing person. But your learners must also know that. And the other important thing is the conclusion that I made, that we all are unfinished beings until we close our eyes. We are always becoming. And as teachers, as lecturers, we always need to renew, revise, revisit, resituate, reanalyze, represent. Paulo Freire. And so it is in our unfinished being that we continue to question and to read and to learn and to do all those things that I mentioned, that we have to be engaged as in our praxis. I think now your banking education and what you said, I think in all of the questions that I have answered, I have addressed that is still our biggest struggle, is getting rid of banking. I don't know why we got that power. Banking education just has this power, and people just automatically, without having learned really how to do it, they go into banking education mode. And so that is very important, that we always have to relate to that, but that we must be aware of the developments of taking how banking education and the understanding thereof have been interpreted and relived in Freirean thought, in particular in this instance, but also all over. We have to reimagine and invent and reinterpret all the time, because we are all unfinished.
Thank you. Well, I think we will leave it there for now, and just do what we have said about the groups that we want to do. But before Dr. Botman get off from the stage, I think it's good that we a little bit read the questions, and if there is a bit of clarification, you give it before we go to groups. Otherwise, maybe there will be a lot of questions asked about what is this about. So I have got your 3 questions, and maybe you could just slightly just explain to us, and then I will, if need be, and then I will divide, because, yeah.
Okay, the question I put is how is banking education challenged and implemented in the lives of all the role players at Cornerstone Institute? That is the basic question. I think I must have read Noel's mind when I thought about the question. And then I thought, instead of taking the whole, tackling the question as a whole, each group could focus on a different aspect. In the first group, conscientization, looking at investigation, codification, decodification, problematization, those concepts. What is it about conscientization, that how can the banking education be challenged and implemented in the lives, not only in the learning, but also in the lives of all the role players at Cornerstone. That includes, you know, who the role players are. And then the second group could look at critical consciousness in particular. That refers to power, awareness, critical literacy, and desocialization as concepts. How can critical consciousness as part of challenge banking education? And then the last one is student-centered dialogue. That's considering, and then I list values such as participatory, situated, critical, democratic, dialogical, multicultural, and so on, as values. And how can these values drive us towards student-centered dialogue, challenging banking education, and implemented at all the role players at Cornerstone. Banking education, simply put, is that the teacher knows everything and the learner is an empty vessel, and so the knowledge comes from somewhere outside of the even the teacher learns it from a textbook or something, and the learner has no say, input, question, whatever, and therefore just all the expertise lies with the teacher and no expertise with the learner, and the learner has nothing to offer.
So let's take our break for 15 minutes and we come and reshuffle. Thank you.